Just a warning, I move a lot. If you look at any of my classes when I teach, if you look at the students and you speed it up, all you see is people going like this. So, that's wanted to let you know ahead of time. I know you all came out to, in part, hear me speak about my book, but I lament to inform you that I'm actually here to sing. This is why there's a microphone. By the way, shout out to the Chicago Workers School and Revolution Report for hosting us in this beautiful setting. I've been here for a day now, and every 20 minutes I tell my wife, Leslie, how beautiful this house is, and how I hope one day to be able to afford a place like this when we have American socialism. My goals for this talk are quite simple. I have two of them. Not to trip over this rug and not to knock over that cup of water. So if I accomplish that, I'll be satisfied. I wanted to start by giving a story. I was just in Mexico a month or two ago. I was giving a series of presentations on my book from last year, The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism, which when the ideas got to Mexico, unfortunately, it seems like they have similar problems as what I theorized the US left as having, which is produces mixed feelings in me. It means that my text is relevant in another area of the world, but it also means that unfortunately, comrades from Mexico or Britain or other parts of the world have to deal with the same BS we do. But when I was in Mexico, I got to speak to quite a few comrades from Cuba, which, by the way, for those that don't know, I'm Cuban. I was born in Cuba. And some of these people worked at the newly made Fidel Castro Center. Some of them worked at the center that's been operated for quite a while, the Che Guevara Center, led by Aleida Guevara, the daughter and also the wife. They both have the same name of Che Guevara. And one of the interesting things that came up in these discussions was their inability to really comprehend how the hell their brothers and sisters to the north, because Cuba's just 90 miles away from the Keys in South Florida, how can they have such a strange position on what socialism is with regard specifically to our national history? They just couldn't comprehend how it is that the left literally phrases socialism as the destruction of America. I've seen a fair amount of tweets and comments from prominent individuals in the main organizations of the US socialist and communist left. I'm sure you know them, I don't have to name them, who will post stuff like "death to America" and hashtags. And I was sitting here with these Cuban comrades, and they just cannot make any sense of it. Because these are people that study Che very closely. They study Fidel very closely. And when they study Fidel and Che, through their works, they're able to see a tremendous appreciation of the revolutionary tradition that we have in the North. So they're looking at me puzzled by how it is that people that call themselves communists and socialists in the North have the audacity to renounce that revolutionary tradition, which Fidel affirmed in one of the most critical conjunctures of the Cuban revolutionary process. In his speech after the attack on the Moncada barracks, "History will absolve me." Part of who he cites is Jefferson and the 1776 Declaration of Independence. He also cites the French. When Ho Chi Minh is writing the Declaration of Independence of Vietnam, what other Declaration of Independence does he cite? The American and the French. What's often lost there, even in some fairly good Marxist scholarship, is the influence the American one had on the French. Doing a review of Los Western Marxism, and that's something that's interestingly missing. But I'm here talking with these Cuban comrades, and they just don't understand it. Because even in Cuba, they appreciate and are inspired by the American revolutionary tradition. And they understand it already spontaneously as, to bring up some Marxist jargon or philosophical jargon, they understand it dialectically. That means that they're able to comprehend it's a complex thing. There's good histories that are a part of America as a social totality, and there's bad ones. And we ought not to reduce the whole to either one part or the other. It's not all bad, and it's not all good either. There's a famous phrase from Jose Marti, the apostle of the Cuban Revolution. He says that men cannot be greater than the sun. There's people that look at the sun and all they see is spots. And there's others that are able to appreciate the light that the sun gives off and the way that it is able to produce life on earth in many ways. And he says we ought not to be condemning the sun for its spots or only celebrating it for the light. We should see it in the unity of opposites in which it existed. And that's a metaphor he uses when he's talking about Father Hidalgo, Bolivar, and many of the main revolutionaries of the 19th century in Central and South America. These were not perfect individuals. They were extremely flawed. But the communists and socialists of the 20th and 21st century picked up on the rational kernels, the best parts of them, and they constructed their socialist projects upon those, on that basis, which means connecting to what is already common sense in your people, because that's your people's tradition. We can reject it all we want, but it's a material, objective reality that we have before us. To reject it is to reject reality itself. One of the interesting conclusions that these Cuban comrades came to, one of the things that they suggested as I presented on the problem of national nihilism in the US, so the rejection of American history, they said, Carlos, why don't you and the groups that you're working with go back to the US and develop patriotic clubs? Patriotic clubs. Can you imagine suggesting on Twitter, hey, what we need is to do patriotic clubs? What would be the reaction of the gatekeepers, of the Twitter leftists, of the purists? Oh, you're Pat Socks. You're Pat Socks. You're this, you're that. So, I published last year The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism, where I provide a framework for thinking systematically about the flaws of the US left, about the worldview that produces different particular manifestations of flaws that if we see them in their disconnection, we won't essentially understand them. As dialectical materialists, we understand that to know the world, we have to know it in how it is interconnected, in the processes that it exists in the relationship to the whole, and the contradictions that pervade those processes. And the point that I made was that the worldview, the way of thinking about the world, engaging with it, of the Western Marxists and of the US Marxists, the US left, is one that's governed by the purity fetish. So a complete antithesis of dialectical thinking. And I make the argument that in the US we have three specific forms that it takes. In the social democratic wing, the rejection of actually existing socialism, which is a common thread of all Western Marxism. It's defined as a tradition in part through its rejection of actually existing socialism, which is absolutely ridiculous in a country that has been governed by McCarthyism, by a history of the state telling people, America is over here, communism, you see, I failed. Communism is on the other side, and there's an unbridgeable gap between the two. So, if you accept the narrative on America, you're accepting the narrative of McCarthyism, the one that we combated so viciously. If you accept what McCarthyism says about socialism, socialism has always failed, it leads to genocides, poverty, etc., etc., you're accepting the narrative of the people that you know, a lot of these social democrats recognize as lying to us about a whole host of things. So if they lie to you about these issues, why not think critically enough to reflect on, well, are they lying to me about other things? Are they lying to me about Russia today, Iran, China? Maybe if these guys are not just in control of the media and ideological apparatuses of today, they're also in control of education and how we tell history. Let me think critically about that too. Let me question that. Let me actually investigate the socialist projects of the 20th century and see them as we see all things. You know, processes in motion with their own contradictions, but trying to survive and build a better world amidst the most insane pressures that anyone can imagine, amidst consistent hybrid warfare. Ever since the Bolshevik Revolution, the baby of socialism was attempted to be strangled in its crib. They did not they have never let socialism develop peacefully. The Soviet Union, right after the revolution, gets invaded by all of Europe. The main great powers, as Lenin described them, 14 countries in total, I believe. It gets blockaded, the same blockade that we critique, that the whole world recognizes the US wrongfully imposes on Cuba. Those same tactics were put on the Bolshevik Revolution. It's an imperialist toolbox, as my colleague over here and brother, Eddie Smith, has called it in the past, that you could see employed in anyone that challenges hegemony and the ruling order, that dares to attempt to move away from the sphere of control of the great imperialist powers. One of the things that we learn when we understand the history of socialism, which is an insight that we get practically, but that we also could comprehend theoretically, is that there's no such thing as socialism in general. I have this app on my phone. It's called the MyFitnessPal app. Does anyone have it as well? Is people familiar with it? You track your calories and stuff. What happens if you go on the MyFitnessPal app and you say, I ate a fruit? What's it going to do? Nothing. It can't track anything because you have to tell it the specific fruit. There's fruit in general, and then there's the particular species of the genus. Socialism doesn't exist in general because it's a concrete reality. It's a universal that in order for it to exist has to take a particular determinate form. Just like in order for the universal concept of fruit to exist, it needs to take various determinate types of fruits in order for you to then track it on your MyFitnessPal app. And this is something that the great Georgy Dimitrov recognized in the middle of the struggle against the fascists. In the middle of the struggle against the fascists, he makes it clear that these processes always require to have socialism as the content that takes a particular national form. National informed socialism content. What's he doing? Is he inventing something? Is this an analysis that starts with him and then we just... No. Go look at Marx and Engels, the manifesto of the Communist Party. Because the people that read these documents don't understand the philosophy, which Marxism is. They don't understand when Marx makes a claim, and Engels, that at the beginning, the struggle for socialism is going to take a national form. They say, oh, it's just the form, it's just the form. They don't understand how Marx is operating within a dialectical framework that comprehends that there's not this antagonistic and divided by hard and fast lines relationship between form and content, appearance and essence, which is how the history of philosophy has operated. The idea is you pierce through the appearance and you find the essence, which is what's really meaningful. No. The essence, the content, can only be as content or essence insofar as it manifests itself as form, or insofar as it manifests itself as appearance. It has to appear. That's central to the essence. The essence has to appear. The content has to take a specific form. And so when Marx says socialism has to take a national form in the manifesto of the Communist Party, he's not saying, oh, it's just a superficial thing and it's fake and we have to really focus on the international arena. No, he's saying In order for socialism to be real in terms of content, it needs to take that national form. But that philosophical basis is not there for it to be understood. A central comment that I start the book with, I cite a Peruvian communist, one of the best mind that we have out of Peru, and one of the best Marxist theorists out of Latin America as a whole, José Carlos Mariátegui, very important thinker, who has a phrase, el socialismo no es una copia, es una creación heroica. Socialism is not a carbon copy. It's a heroic creation. What does that mean? That you need to give socialism the distinctive, specific language of your people. You need to adjust it to the context of the peoples that have waged or are waging the struggle for political power. It's a basic insight that if you understand dialectics, you understand, well, this universal thing of class struggles and socialism needs to take a particular form. But this phrase, it has to be a heroic creation, is very, very interesting. And it's also something we see in Marx at the end. You know, you have this, as someone who's still in the academy, I have to, unfortunately, hang out with a lot of these types of people who, to be nice, who say things like, Marxism is Eurocentric. Marxism is Eurocentric. The ideology that the global South, Africa, Asia, Latin America, the tricontinental, the ideology that the global South has taken up, the most important one in waging its anti-colonial struggles, that ideology is Eurocentric. It's a very interesting argument. But on the basis of what? They say, oh, Marx and Engels in their earlier works held that socialism was going to come out of the advanced industrial capitalist countries, Britain, France, the United States, and only after the global South, the rest, the periphery, whatever you want to call it, the colonized world, only after they're able to develop capitalism are they going to be have the capacity, once they have the proletariat, to build socialism. But what happens around the time before Marx's death in 1883? From the late 1860s, the 70s, and then the early 1880s. Marx begins studying various anthropologists. Lewis Henry Morgan, an American who studied the Iroquois. He studies Maxim Kovalevsky, a Russian anthropologist, follower of Lewis Henry Morgan, who was reporting about the Incas, who was reporting about Indian societies and other indigenous communities across the Americas. Around the same time as he's engaging with these people, Kovalevsky specifically referred to him as one of his scientific friends. He said, I have my revolutionary friends and my scientist friends. Those are the two categories he fell into. He knew Marx and were his friend. And he's like, I prefer the revolutionary ones. But Kovalevsky was one of the good scientist friends. And he's reading these reports from Kovalevsky, and he's like, why are you bringing the categories that I develop specific to the historical unfolding of class struggles in Europe to Peru, to Latin America, to India? It doesn't make any sense. And he says you can't copy and paste the things that become evident through the development of these processes in one context onto another context. You can't just copy and paste it. This is something that for those, this part is a little bit more familiar. Some of the stuff that I just talked about is like mainly manuscripts. But the engagement with Vera Sasulic, a Russian populist. Vera Sasulic sends a letter to Marx and asks, look, we have this divide in the Russian left. Surprise, surprise, the left divided. Who would have known? Between the populists that think that the Obshchina, the Russian commune, has revolutionary potential. Because it's basically what used to be called primitive communism. Now it's called primary communism. It's very PC change, but I approve it. We have the populists who think that the Obshchina is a good route for socialism. that we don't have to be waiting till we develop capitalism, that we're capable of doing what Nikolai Chernyshevsky, has anyone heard that name? Chernyshevsky? If you know a little book that's over there, What is to be Done, that's a title that Lenin takes from Chernyshevsky, right? Great Russian populist thinker. Oh, Eddie, you see? Last time you told me you're berating me in the stream for the Discord, and here we go.
Except I actually know how to turn it off.
That's what the problem is. I couldn't figure out how to turn it off. One of the...
Turn it off for you, you can keep going.
No. It hasn't even made a noise. It's made like 2 noises.
All right. Keep going.
I just wanted to get them in the camera, because now the views go up. The book sales go up.
Should have done an introduction. Carlos Garrido is an ugly American fool.
If you guys see what he left me here as a note, it's a very bad best friend. Very mean one. Where was I? Chernyshevsky has this famous phrase that history has its favorite. To the late comers, it gives the marrow. To the younger ones, it gives the bones. So when you come and you're developing late in history, the process of developing things that in another context might have taken 800 years to develop is a lot quicker because it's already developed over there. So you had the populists on one side that were saying, look, let's use the Община, the commune. Let's take the developments of the West that capitalism has produced, and on that basis build communism. And then you had some of the orthodox Marxists who were reading Marx on the basis of conclusions but not method, and Marxism is a method, it's a worldview. And these people were basically saying, no, we have to wait. We have to wait for capitalism to develop. How are we going to have socialism without a proletariat? It's absurd. So Vera Sassulish sends a letter to Marx. And she asked Marx, what do you think? And Marx writes 3 drafts that are like 40 to 60 pages long. And then he writes a 4th one. That's a short little reply. And what he concludes is that, look, this historical unfolding where you have primary communism, slave society, mode of production, then you have feudalism, then you have capitalism, socialism, communism, that stage of development is specific to the context that I'm studying. Other parts of the world can have different historical paths. Russia has never had the feudalism in the form that it took in the West. There's still the commune, and there's still, therefore, the potential of the commune to be used for revolution. And in that way, Marx stood against the Marxists, right? And prioritized the necessity of understanding the concrete conditions in Russia and of not being dogmatic, not just copying and pasting conclusions from one context onto another. So the idea of this book, American Marxism, or American Socialism, socialism with American characteristics, it's not new. It wasn't just invented by the Institute or by other political actors in the American scene. It's very old. It's the basis of a correct understanding of what the Marxist worldview entails. One of the things that has been central for the ruling class, not just in our country, but for every other ruling class in the world, is to completely remove the history of the people. The people's history of struggle, regardless of how rich it is going to be ignored, it's going to be slandered, it's going to be domesticated. I mean, who else in our country do we give a national holiday to? MLK. But is it the MLK that was called the most dangerous man in America that we celebrate? I don't think so. Was it the MLK that, after finishing the Civil Rights Revolution, said, we're in a new phase of struggle, now we got to fight for a greater democracy? With black and white united and fighting for the cause of labor through the Poor People's Campaign. What organization's slogan was black and white unite and fight in the 1930s? Does anyone know? Any hands?
CPUSA?
The Communist Party! So King ended basically understanding, okay, now that we overthrew apartheid and segregation, now it's easier for black and white unite and fight and for us to have full emancipation. But the king that we study and celebrate, that our politicians cite, is not the real king. So our progressive history, which is extremely rich, is ignored, it's lied about, it's slandered, and it's domesticated, distorted in order to fit within the parameters of what's acceptable for hegemony. In the same way that Lenin, when he starts State and Revolution, which I think is also back there, I might be wrong, says the same thing. You know, Marxism is distorted into something that becomes a caricature of what it actually is, a safe caricature, of course. This is something that the great Michael Parenti, who is someone I consider myself and the Institute to be following upon the work that he's built, he's very clear. In his book, is one of the least read ones, but History is Mystery. In the first chapter, one of the things that he cites is this meta-study of US textbooks about US history. None of them talk about labor. And when they bring up radical struggles, they call them terrorists. They criticize them, they slander them. So, if that's the reality that our ruling class wants people to think, and they do care a whole lot about what regular people think, what are we, the people that want to overthrow that order, to do? Do we just accept this narrative and continue our struggles as if we don't have a rich legacy that objectively, whether we recognize it or not, provides the historical legs for our movement? Obviously not. We have to counter that. We have to counter those lies and distortions of history. And so what I do in this book is, in a way, picking up on where I finish in the purity fetish. Because the third form that it takes is that national nihilism that I mentioned. Which is interesting, because the people that do it, they do it out of a sort of progressive veneer. You know, they're very woke, right, and enlightened. But what's interesting about that is that if you actually study the history of socialism and understand, as I mentioned, that in every single instance, socialism is the content that has to take a national form. If you're saying, no, we're not going to do that, America's too evil, we want to abolish America, not sublate, you know, leaving the bad parts behind and taking the good parts. Get rid of it. I don't like it. If that's your treatment to it, I'm sorry to say this, but you're saying America's the exception. That's American exceptionalism, liberal tinted American exceptionalism, which is a form of chauvinism, frankly, right? This is the real horseshoe theory, right? The Radlibs and the ideology of the ruling class. And so I conclude with that point. We're going to have a socialism that's unique to our context. In this book, I start by asking another question. If socialism has to take on a national form, what about Marxism? Can we just have just the regular text of Marx, Engels, and Lenin and succeed? Well, depends on what we do with those texts. The thesis that I postulate in this book, that I tried to make explicit from what's been implicit in the history of the greatest radical thinkers of America, is that we need an American Marxism. An American Marxism, a Marxism that is cognizant of, rooted in a deep understanding of the class struggles that have shaped the trajectory of our nation. This is the Marxism that works. This is the Marxism that's going to work. It's when the Chinese say, look, Stalin, we love you. We love the Soviet Union. We respect it tremendously. But we're not going to take direct orders on what to do in our country from Moscow. We're going to figure it out ourselves because it's our country, we understand it, and develop socialism with Chinese characteristics and Sinified Marxism. That's when they succeed. And so what I have in this book is a plea, it's a plea to a process of engaging consciously in the construction of American Marxism. We have to ask ourselves the questions. How is it that the Chinese or the Bolivarians, socialists, how is it that they're doing? You know, are they just going back and saying, who are all the good Marxists in our past? Let's build from those guys. Is that what they're doing? No. China today is even going back to the rational kernels of the Confucian traditions that have been around for millenniums in their very rich and ancient civilizational state. And they're drawing the most important kernels out of the best and most important thinking that its people have produced over its very long history. So they're not just going back to the Marxists. They're going back to everything comprehensively. What can we pull from Confucianism? What can we pull from Lao Tzu? And the different, in the West we call it wisdom traditions, right? In philosophy department they call Asian philosophy, Chinese philosophy, they call it wisdom, they don't call it philosophy. But in essence, what can we pull from the greatest thinkers, the greatest philosophers of our history? And for the US, the same thing is going to happen. In order to develop an American Marxism, just like the Chinese did a Sinified Marxism, we're going to have to look at our history comprehensively and dialectically. That means not just going back and basing ourselves on the good Marxists, but understanding the rational kernels, the progressive components of the history as a whole. I think that one of the first things we can see is the indigenous communities in the US. I'm not referencing them here like one of the leftist wokes that just romanticizes the indigenous. These are real struggles that were waged. And those struggles are not disconnected from the other struggles of America. Part of what the left likes to do is say, no, what the indigenous have done is a struggle against this process of unfolding of America. To even call yourself American is something negative. It's interesting because the largest indigenous organization, what's its name? Any help here? The American Indian Movement, right? Okay. They don't reject the claim that they're American, because they are. They call them the First Nations even. They're American, and their struggles against forms of colonialism are parts of our rich revolutionary history. One of the things that Lewis Henry Morgan realizes in his struggles of the Iroquois is that they had a communism in living. So that's a specific phrase. They had communism in living. The relations through which these communities based themselves were communist relations. There wasn't a state in the sense of an institutional organ that can manage class contradictions and antagonisms. There wasn't necessarily even class divisions. There was a division of labor, but there weren't class divisions. The question of property and who has and who doesn't, who works and who has the capacity to just leisurely relax and parasitically suck out what other people produce, that wasn't a question for them. They had a communism in living, as Lewis Henry Morgan formulated. And what's interesting, when you look at anthropological research of even some of the first colonists, they were looking at these indigenous communities and they were learning. They were learning from these indigenous communities. So baked into even the process of forming this new people in this continent is a dialectical interaction with the people that were already here, learning from it. It gets messy, it gets ugly, but there were insights that were drawn by the most progressive traditions in these historical struggles. I think, therefore, that's a good starting point for the retelling of the progressive history of America. Before America gets established as a state in 1776, you had various colonists that held very interesting positions. One of these was Roger Williams. When he saw that some of the people around him wanted to elevate themselves to a position of supremacy and to downgrade, dehumanize the indigenous, what does Roger Williams do? He says, this is against the teaching of Christ. We are all equal in God's eyes. This was one of the central, the first settlers, rejecting completely American exceptionalism. In the American Revolution, you have a contradictory event. Today it is popular, it's become a fad, accepted by the liberal wing of bourgeois hegemony, which is the most efficient one, to describe the American Revolution as a counter-revolution. And for anyone interested, and the historian that has popularized it, and why it's wrong, there's a man in this room by the name of Marius Trotter who has debunked it systematically, and I urge you all to read his work debunking the thesis of the counter-revolution of 1776 as it's put forth by Gerald Horne, who has been the one that has popularized it. It's not a thesis he invented, but he did popularize it and was the basis in many ways for the 1619 project. What that does is say the bad parts, the bad aspects of the American Revolution, those are the defining ones. It's a synecdochal treatment of the whole. It means taking a part and elevating it to the whole. You're defining the whole on the basis of a part. Just like it's wrong to say that, 1776 as a whole is just defined by Paine's line. It's not. It was an objective contradiction. You did have the interest of a planter class, of a slaveocracy that wanted to perpetuate slavery and colonial expansion. Then you also had other factions, the Jeffersonian factions, the dissenters, as historians have called them, who were very progressive, who were extremely progressive for their time. There's a reason why in Europe you can't teach at that time the Declaration of Independence. So the 1776 revolution is an objective contradictory process. And for us Marxists, again, we define things in their process, in their movement. And the aspect of the contradictions that we examine that takes primacy is what Mao would call the principal aspect of contradictions. The one that's more influential. Marx would also use the phrase the point of departure in various instances. And if we look at this history on the basis of that contradiction in 1776, which has been the pole that has most defined the American trajectory, the process of the social totality as a whole? Was it the slave owners, or was it the ideas of Paine and Jefferson? I think it is very clear that the ideas of Jefferson, Paine, and the Democratic Creed, whose spirit is embodied in the Declaration of Independence, have been the most influential in shaping the trajectory of the country. Within a few decades after the revolutions, the revolution in the 1820s, you have a series of very interesting thinkers arise. People like Cornelius Blatchley. Has anyone heard of them? No hands were raised. Get that camp. No one heard of them. Langdon Billsby. Any hands? I know why you heard of it. Eddie raised his hand. William McClure. Should be a little bit more popular. You're raising your hand halfway.
Rings a bell.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. If you're a geologist, maybe you've studied William McClure. He's the founder of American geology. Let's see, who else? Thomas Skidmore. He should be a little bit more popular. Has anyone heard of Thomas Skidmore? Oh, Eddie. Marius, a little bit. Good, good. These were people who in the 1820s and 30s were looking at the utopian communities that Marx and Engels were drawing inspiration from and that took place here in the US. Utopian communist communities. They were looking at those experiments and they said, wow, I don't think an approach to building a new world which says we have to basically beg progressive rich people to actually live up to their ideals, give us the money so that we can build these communities, based not on notions of class struggle, but collaborating, and this abstract, not concrete notion of humanity. They were looking at these utopian communities that wanted to escape the system, build something outside of it. And they were saying that doesn't make any sense. That's not how you build a new world. In order to build a new world, and this is something that they all share, we have to understand scientifically, the current world that we have. And on the basis of the tensions in the world that we have, what we're seeing, gross inequality where a small group of people end up developing and hoarding a whole lot of wealth, controlling a whole lot of wealth, while the mass of humanity that produces that wealth has little to nothing. That was something Paine was talking about. Jefferson was talking about it. Jefferson was talking about the politicians that identify with the interests of those that have that wealth as being the aristocratic men, and the others being the democratic men. And he said that if it comes to be that the aristocratic men win, the fate of our glorious revolution is going to be in shambles. So there's already a critique there. But these thinkers, they looked at these utopian experiments and they said, no, we have to understand the system scientifically, and on the basis of that understanding, we'll see within that system how the components are already present for developing a new world. And I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I love these guys right here, Marx and Engels. I have big portraits of them in my rooms, my library room. But what that means is that what they developed, Marxism, scientific socialism, was already attempted in the US 20 years before. The main texts of scientific socialism arise in the 1840s. And these are people publishing books in 1826, trying to provide a systematic understanding of capitalism and how, on that basis, a new society could be built. And we don't know who the hell they are. Not only are they not known in the world communist movement, they're not even, can I curse? Excuse my French. They're not even fucking known by American communists. It's preposterous. It's absurd. These people were brilliant. They were ahead of their times in ways in which the people that were the most ahead of their times weren't even there. Marx and Engels were in diapers when these people were writing about scientific socialism. Yes, they didn't have the level of concreteness that Marx and Engels did, because American capitalism was very underdeveloped. So they don't get to, I'm not saying call them the founders of scientific socialism, but they attempted it. And we should recognize this. And what was the basis of that attempt? Were these people saying, you know, there's these French that are talking about this thing called socialism. We should bring it over here. It's a foreign ideology, but it sounds cool. Let's apply it here. No, they weren't. They looked at Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, the Democratic Creed, and they said, you cannot fundamentally have the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, a conception that all men, all of humanity is equal in a system like the one that we have. That what it does is take the feudal absolutisms that the bourgeoisie attempted and partially succeeded in abolishing in the political realm, and entrenches them tenfold times as much in the economic realm. What good is it to me to go to a booth and vote every 2 years and call that democracy when the fucking place I spend 10 hours at working, I do not have a say over how anything is made, over what's done with it, over what's produced, why, who it's sold to, for how much? Where's the democracy? And so what these people understood is that if you're actually committed to the American values of the Declaration of Independence, you have to understand that socialism is the logical and practical conclusion of those values. And this cannot become more evident than with the Gettysburg Address, where Lincoln emphasizes the importance of defending government of, by, and for the people. And when we have a society where government is of, by, and for big corporations, investment firms, the major banks, in other words, a society that's of, by, and for big capital, you cannot claim to have a society that's of, by, and for the people. Those two things are in contradiction. If you have the one, you cannot have the other. You cannot have the other. If the American people accept the idea that we need government of, by, and for the people, what they are accepting is socialism. If the American people accept the values of 1776, what they're accepting is socialism. Because what those values represent is the kernel, the embryonic form that the ideas of socialism eventually are developed into. Implicit in those ideas is the necessity of arriving at socialism if you're faithful to the progression of the development of those ideas. If you take what's implicit and you make it explicit, you get socialism. So if the American people already accept this, how are you going to sit here and tell me that socialism is anti-American? There ain't nothing more American than socialism. If we look at the main currents in American philosophy, there's two. There's transcendentalism, right? Famous authors, Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau. Right? It was essentially an anti-capitalist philosophy. Prominent historians in the 20th century called Ralph Waldo Emerson America's first philosopher, a forefather of American communism. Who had heard that before? No. Henry David Thoreau. There's a progressive historian that just died, Stoughton Lynd. Has anyone heard of Stoughton Lynd? He just passed a year and a half ago, I believe. He wrote a book, Origins of American Radicalism. It's an essential book to read. There's a chapter where he just gives you quotes from Thoreau and Marx. And he says, guess. Alienation of labor, the disconnection of what it means to be actually human, the product of our labor. That's something common in both quotes, and you're forced to guess. And you're like, what, is that Marx? It can't be Emerson. There's no way. He's American. And when you look into it, a lot of them were Emerson. They're almost indistinguishable. So, not Emerson, excuse me, Thoreau. A lot of them were Thoreau. So, one of the main philosophers of one of the two tendencies that has developed in American philosophy, there's passages that are indistinguishable from Marx, especially the younger Marx. And what newspaper was he writing for at that time? Let me give you a hint. Oh, we got a hand here.
Was it New York Times?
Not necessarily, close. Same city.
Was it the New York Tribune?
The New York Daily Tribune. Who also was writing for that?
Marx.
Marx. Well, there was times where Engels wrote it under Marx's name. But to get to help his buddy with finances.
Horace Greeley.
Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley's newspaper.
Yeah.
So we have an American philosopher writing in the same progressive paper as Karl Marx, putting forth ideas that sometimes are almost indistinguishable when we're told to guess, as Stoughton Lynd did, who's who. Telling me that socialism is anti-American. If you believe that, I got a bridge to sell you. The other main current in American philosophy, any guesses what it is? If we have transcendentalism, what's the other one?
Pragmatism.
Pragmatism. American pragmatism. It's extremely popular, by the way, in China. I have the pleasure of working at the Center for Dewey Studies in my university, where all of Dewey's manuscripts are. You know what's the only country that has translated all of Dewey's published works? China. They see it as a thinker that is extremely important and that shares many overlaps with Marxism, and it's extremely insightful. A couple seasons ago, when I had just published The Purity Fetish, I sent Eddie a quote, which he writes on his whiteboard for his wrestlers. Who is the quote from? Do you remember?
I'm drawing a blank. What quote is it?
The one about the purity fetish. You wrote it down in your whiteboard. He will be punished for this, by the way. The folks at home.
I write a lot of stuff on the whiteboard as well.
It was a Dewey quote. It was a Dewey quote. It's John Dewey. Talking about how if you commit yourselves to living in a world where you only accept those things which measure up to a pure ideal, you can't live life. Life is messy. It's critiquing the purity fetish. And you used it with your wrestlers, because in wrestling, a match is not the same thing as practice. Practice, the moves are executed very purely. The person you're practicing with, part of what they do is go with your moves. That's not the same thing that happens when you have a real tension. And the moves are not executed purely. If your kids expect their moves to be pure, when it actually counts, that's the sort of mindset that destroys them. But here we have a central insight that we're trying to develop as a communist institute in America that was already found in John Dewey. Does anyone know what Dewey's nickname was? America's philosopher of democracy. America's philosopher of democracy. John Dewey came to the conclusion, again, on the basis of the democratic creed found in the Declaration of Independence, that you can't realize those values without socialism. If industry is developing in a form where the development is premised on the accumulation of a few at the expense of the many, there's no democracy there. And he took it further than just that. He said, politics ends up functioning as the shadow of big business. What does that mean? Wherever big business goes, politics is following. What does that mean? That who owns controls politics. Do you have democracy? No. It's the same thing with all the other institutions, the educational ones, the media, etc. He was fundamentally a socialist, of a certain kind. He wasn't a communist. He was very much misled, as many other progressive thinkers of his age, about what was going on in the Soviet Union. But America's philosopher of democracy, ending in these conclusions, and you want to tell me that America is fundamentally anti-socialist? That's very strange. Charles Sanders Peirce, has anyone heard the name? The founder of pragmatism. Although he probably wouldn't like us calling him that, because when William James develops his pragmatism, also an anti-imperialist in the Anti-Imperialist League, considered himself an anti-capitalist anarchist. I hate to admit that, but he did. He's still on the left, broadly. When William James develops his pragmatism, Peirce is like, that's not the stuff I developed. So what I'm doing, I'm going to call it pragmaticism. If you look at Peirce, specifically this essay, Evolutionary Love, what he puts forth is a Christian utopian socialism on the basis of the notion of agapism, Christian love. To realize Christian love, you need a fundamental reorganization of society to prioritize human needs and not profit. Then he looks at the question of knowledge, the development of knowledge historically. And what does bourgeois individualism tell us that knowledge emanates from? Who are the knowledge producers according to bourgeois ideology? Any takers? Does anyone want to answer that? Who produces knowledge according to bourgeois ideology? Individuals. Extraordinary individuals. You have Descartes in his little dark closet in the corner just writing, deciphering the essential truths of the world, disconnected from everything. What Peirce did was criticize that bourgeois individualist conception of knowledge and put forth in that essay a conception of logic, epistemology, and history that is fundamentally collective. Challenging, therefore, at these levels of how we think about logic, so systems of thinking, how we think about how it is that we come to know the world, epistemology, and how we think about history, challenging the central assumptions, the valuative assumptions, essential for reproducing the bourgeois order, of the bourgeois order. In the same way that at his own time, Socrates was challenging the values that allowed for the systematic reproduction of Athens. And what did they do to him? Gone, right? That's something we could talk about at some other point. I've gotten to the point of my notes where Eddie says, quit rambling, Eddie is zoning out. I think you lied about this one. You seem pretty engaged. On the basis of these struggles, we talked about the main philosophies that we have and their affinities with socialism, sometimes even an explicit endorsement of it. But on the basis of these struggles, we have, after those first socialists in the 1820s and 30s, a very interesting development with the abolitionist cause, which was not just this woke race thing. No, it was the front lines of the class struggle. Because you had in the US South a planter class that was fundamentally federating the development of class struggles and the fights that working people were waging, not just in the South, but also in the North. Who were the abolitionists inspired by in their ideas? Were the abolitionists, as Horn and all the woke leftists from today would like us to think, were the abolitionists these people that said, you know, I hate America. America is garbage. I can't stand it. It's purely evil. Was that what the abolitionists were doing? No. The 4th of July just passed some days ago. What text was everyone on the national nihilist left sharing? I know you know this.
What to enslave is the 4th of July?
Ah. What is the 4th of July to a slave? Frederick Douglass. Very interesting. They take some quotes where he's calling out the hypocrisy of a system that proclaims these values but then has these realities. And what do the leftists do? Thinking as good bourgeois themselves, disconnecting things from everything else. They disconnect some quotes from the Douglass speech, and they say that he was condemning America. He was calling out America's hypocrisy. America is fundamentally hypocritical. It will never live up to its values, and we have to condemn it. And that translates into a way of doing politics today. It's not just a thinking about history, it has concrete implications, which divide working people at a time where we're more united organically than ever. If you actually look at that text, though, my friend here, Marius, I know you wrote about it in your Instagram. If you actually look at the text, what he's saying is America, as another great thinker, MLK will do later on, America, live up to what you are capable of living up to. You started yourself off as a state in a way that no one in human history had done. No one had proclaimed with their revolution, with the founding of their state, all men are equal, endowed by their Creator, with the rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It's a declaration of independence that founds a state with a notion that you have the right to revolution. It's very ironic that America, the country that has stopped countries around the world from completing their revolutions, was the one that was founded on the right to revolution and national self-determination. But what Frederick Douglass was actually saying is, live up to what you say you want it to be and what you can be. That's the essence of the article, not America bad. It's America. Be America. Be more American. That's what the essence of Douglass's article was. And that event that he was one of the thought leaders of, which we call simply a civil war, it wasn't just a civil war. It was a revolution. If you read the person who we call the father of American Marxism, W.E.B. Du Bois, which is why his head is up there, If you read his Black Reconstruction, a masterpiece that should be placed alongside Marx's Capital, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and Hegel's Science of Logic. If you read Black Reconstruction, one of the things that you understand is that we've been completely lied to, surprise, surprise, about the period of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Completely lied to. For Du Bois, who's actually studying this and not just trying to spin bourgeois ideology and the ideas that benefit the ruling order, what you had in the Civil War was a revolution. There was an objective contradiction. It was Marxist analysis through and through. There was an objective contradiction between the planter class in the South and the Southern Cotton Kingdom, which is striving to become a cotton empire by expanding west and south into the Americas, Central and South America. You had that interest of expansion, which was in contradiction with the northern capitalist interest. That produced an objective situation. What do you say? Oh, God. We got to be better at signaling. Doing this, we got to go like this. What are you doing? You had this objective contradiction that clashed and produced the Civil War. And for the beginning of the Civil War, it looked like what side was going to win? History test.
The South was doing well?
The South was doing well. South was, it looked like it was going to win. But something happens, which Du Bois notes and no one else had noted. The evidence was there for them to get it. But they were racist and they wanted to defend the system, so they looked past it. But the evidence was there and Du Bois unfolds it. What happens is that the 4 million enslaved black proletariat, right? Not just slaves. Black proletariat or enslaved proletariat. What does that do? It's a new categorical framework that allows you to see the connection of the proletariat in the North with the one in the South. It shows you how it's different in the category, but also how it's united. And that's important because none of the major socialists at the time, take Orestes Bronson, one of the main radicals, he was in the Democratic Party, he was pro-slavery. And he was pro-slavery because he thought you had to solve the question of wage slavery before chattel slavery. Even the 48ers, right, the German revolutionaries that came, they didn't give a shit about the question of slavery until after. When it breaks out into the Civil War, they get involved in it. You have August Willich, Joseph Weidmeyer, who play an essential role for the Union Army. But at the beginning, you look at some of the newspapers these people were developing, founding, they weren't talking about slavery. They were looking at it as a secondary issue that distracts from this class struggle that we're doing. What we're doing is class struggle. When it's white people, it's class struggle. When it's in the South and it's enslaved black workers fighting, it's not class struggle. What Du Bois does by calling it, in the first chapter of Black Reconstruction, the black proletariat, now you have unity. Now you have a theoretical framework for thinking through that struggle as a class struggle, which these other people were not fundamentally able to do. That's why we call him the father of American Marxism. He's the first to understand the determinate, specific, particular form that the class struggle takes in our context. But when he's writing about the Civil War, what he recognizes is that the 4 million enslaved black proletariat in the US South were what allowed the North to win. They waged a revolution, what he called a general strike. The enslaved black proletariat of the US South fled to enemy lines. They fled north. They removed the productive base of the US South and they gave the North spies, workers, and soldiers. And they won the war. It was a general strike that won the war. Now think if workers, regular white factory workers, waged a general strike that overthrow the order that they lived in. What would we call that? A revolution. Why has no one called it a revolution until Du Bois? It's a real question to ask. It's a limited conception of the class struggle, and of course, a mixture of racism in there, a white blind spot. The inability to see in the struggle of black people a class struggle. You categorize it as something completely different, but it's not. So, what Du Bois realizes is that this was a general strike that won the war, and it was a revolution. It was the Second American Revolution, and what it fought for was to realize the values of 1776. Year 1776 again. And what happens? You have this period of Reconstruction where the Northern Army is backing with all its might the Freedmen's Bureau. But what was the Freedmen's Bureau? It was an organization of recently emancipated black workers who were the ones in control of carrying forth the transformation of the U.S. South in the states that had been defeated. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, that is a dictatorship of the proletariat. Because you have this organized working class body dictating on the basis of its power, yes, backed up by the Northern Army, but on the basis of its power, its will, and defending its interests as black and white workers. And this is a period that lasts almost 10 years, until 1876, when there's a counter-revolution of property, and that's overthrown. And you go from emancipation and a new democracy, an abolitionist democracy, which is what Du Bois called it, back to a new form of slavery, and apartheid, and segregation, and lynching for black people. But what happened in that period was a dictatorship of the proletariat. Every year, every single year, there's an event in commemoration of the Paris Commune. I like the Paris Commune. The way I said that, I sounded like Kanye in that clip. I like Gaga. What does she know about cameras? Has anyone seen it? When they use her in the commercial for the Polaroid? I like the Paris Commune. But the Paris Commune happened well after this dictatorship of the proletariat in the U.S. South, led by black workers. And it lasted 3 months. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure it's 3 months. We celebrated every single year. Reconstruction and the dictatorship of the proletariat, that was the essence of the social system for that period of time in the U.S. South, lasted a decade. You want to tell me that America is fundamentally anti-socialist when we had the first modern dictatorship of the proletariat and it lasted a hell of a lot longer than the Paris Commune? Really? With Du Bois, what we have is that transition from just good progressive thinkers that we pull from to the development of the Marxist framework within the national context of America. So here, we're not just picking from the progressive tradition, but an American Marxism that might not explicitly formulate itself as American Marxism, but that's American Marxism. That's where we start with explicit American Marxism. The counter-revolution of property of 1876 will provide the conditions for how the class struggle is going to take shape for the next almost 100 years. Because you have in the U.S. South a condition of second-class citizenship for black people. You have apartheid. Segregation is apartheid. And in those struggles in the U.S. South, what was one of the most important parties in the 30s organizing against apartheid in the U.S. South?
Communism?
The Communist Party. It was the party that brought the victory of the Scottsboro Boys case. In this period of struggle, which culminates in the Third American Revolution, we call it a civil rights movement, but it's a political revolution.
Right.
It's a political revolution. There's a difference between there being objectively still bigoted people and racism in some American institutions, especially policing. There's a difference between that being an objective reality, existing de facto, and it existing de jure. it being given legitimacy by the state and its juridical apparatuses. When you overthrow that condition, you have waged a successful political revolution. That's what the Third American Revolution was. That's what MLK's movement produced. Today in the left, you have this shallow comparison with MLK and Malcolm X or other figures, the Panthers, etc. And MLK is just some reformist. We toss him to the side. It's not that important. The bourgeoisie talks about him and the politicians, pay lip service to him. So why do we have to read him? We're communists. It's a very shallow way of looking at the world. There's a good way to tell who's real in terms of their dissent of the established order and who isn't. Look at who's attacked more. If you're propped up by the forces of hegemony, it doesn't matter how badly you want to identify as a dissenter, you ain't dissenting shit. Because the people you're supposed to be dissenting from are propping you up. But if you are maligned, lied about, spied on, and killed, you are the enemy of hegemony. And MLK was described not just as an enemy, but the most dangerous man in America. No one had been arrested more than Martin Luther King Jr. And today the left has the audacity to undermine his struggle. And they pay lip service to it, very similar to the bourgeoisie. But when they say the condition that America's in, and then they fill what comes next by describing a society as if 1964 and the Civil Rights Act didn't happen, they're undermining King. They're undermining that class struggle that won the overthrow of apartheid, that created the conditions so that today, young people are a hell of a lot more likely to be anti-racist than racist. Racism is something that's not only frowned upon, it's a joke. It's a joke. People think it's fucking stupid. Because it is. It's always been irrational. But that's the common sense perspective in most of America now. Now the ruling class is using actual racists. They're trying to prop up racism through figures like Nicolas Fuentes and others on Twitter. So, hopefully it stays being the case that the majority of America is anti-racist, but they're going to go to that again to divide. That's always been the purpose. Divide, divide, divide. Because when you divide, you can rule, you can conquer. But MLK was killed. Fred Hampton was killed. Malcolm was killed. How big were the protests? Not very big. What we have in 2020 is random black individual gets killed by the police. And we have the largest protest in the history of the country. 25 to 30 million people are in the streets. A lot of white people. Angry. Feeling like, no, they just killed a random black person. No, that's not what they felt like. They felt like they killed one of us. They felt like they killed one of us, and they did. And what that means is that we have a new America. An America that has been shaped by these revolutionary struggles. That is at a new stage in the American trajectory. Such that if we refer to America as it was in the 1940s, our analysis is completely wrong and can even serve the cause of division. Because we're already essentially a people. We're united. Yes, there's diversity. E pluribus unum. Out of many, one. That's the slogan of America. We're today more united than ever. That doesn't mean that there aren't differences in various communities, but we're united. When you can get 30 million people, and look, I understand all the critiques of BLM, it's co-opting by the Democratic Party, and yes, that's true. But 30 million people hitting the streets after the killing of a random black person shows that the racial consciousness of the American people has fundamentally changed, and it's nowhere near to what it was when King was around. Because King got killed and that didn't happen. What we see here is a trajectory, a movement, a development. And we have to ask, what is it developing towards? What is it developing towards? I think it's developing towards socialism. Because socialism for me, as it was for the thinkers of the 1820s, as it was for MLK, as it was for Du Bois, as it was for Henry Winston and all the greatest thinkers in American history, and in world history. Because MLK is a world historic thinker, not just American. We're grateful he's American. But the implications of his insights have spread across the whole world. In Cuba, there's an MLK Center where they study his thought thoroughly. The conclusion of all of the greatest thinkers in American history has been that you can only realize the values that America was founded on if we have socialism. And the context that we have today cannot be more fertile for waging the sort of struggle that can realize those ends, that can realize those ideals. In the 1970s, the stability that a part of the specifically white working class had obtained, where you were legitimately able to have one job, take care of a whole family, go out to eat in the weekends, have vacations a few times a year, something that seems impossible for the youth today to even conceive of. You had a stability for a few decades. What was it premised on? Not the fact, as Marcuse would say and others in the ultra-left, that the working class had sold out, they had been absorbed into the system. No. You had an alternative in the Soviet Union. You had a strong communist movement that was actually able to win concessions for the working class. And you also had the fact that we're in the empire. And the capitalist class is smart enough to take the super profits that it makes in looting the global south and give a little bit to parts of it. That period wasn't going to last very long. You had sociologists and thinkers running around like a chicken with their head cut off. Oh my God, is class struggle finished? We have a middle class. Marx didn't predict the expansion of this middle class to the scale that we've seen. Marxism is doomed. How do we reinterpret the whole situation? Change the theory of class struggle. They were foolish. They were short-sighted. Because Marxists understood that this is perhaps a very temporary period. What you have in the 1970s is the rolling back of all of that. The commencing of a process that my colleague, my brother in arms, Noah Krashevik, does anyone know him? Let's get a hoorah for Noah so he can see us later on in the year. Hoorah! There we go. That's for you, Noah. We have a process called reproletarianization. Because this objective stability that elevated the working class, a part of it, to a position that Engels described as bourgeoisification. They had bourgeoisified. They got reproletarianized. Now the lives of the vast majority of working people are governed by figuring out how the hell to make ends meet. They're governed by poverty, debt, and desperation. And debt like never before. And debt is, remember, if we read the 3 volumes of Capital, not just the first one. In the 3rd volume of Capital, Marx calls debt a secondary form of exploitation. There's the primary form that exists in the moment of production and the secondary form that it takes when working people are indebted. That's a reality that all Americans experience. I have barely started my life as an adult and I'm already $100,000 in debt. How can I start a family? There's no job prospects. 100K in debt. So that stability gone. We have reproletarianized. Which means that if there was a period where that stability was a fetter for the class struggle, because if you're really comfortable, it's kind of hard to wage a revolutionary struggle, that stability's gone. And then the other factor that was dividing us, which is racism, it's not fully gone, but it's been largely defeated. The social consciousness of the American people has fundamentally transformed. Even bigots, which I've met some of them in the Midwest, they're not at the level of thinking where they say, I do not want to organize with a black worker or an immigrant worker. No. They might hold stereotypical racist views, but they don't take it to the extreme that was taken back in the day where they were excluding black people from unions, and literally objectively dividing the class struggle. So the main fetters that we had in the past for waging a class struggle that could succeed have been removed. And we find ourselves in a condition where, as Lenin said, the ruling class cannot rule in the old way, and the people are not willing to continue living in the old way. And that constitutes an objective revolutionary condition. Something we should be cheerful for, as people that want to change the system in a revolutionary manner. We have a crisis of legitimacy in our hands. Only 11% of the American people buy into what the media says. What does that mean? That the main apparatuses of hegemonic control, of the control of ideas, of what it is that people are thinking about specific events, the people say, you're bullshitting me. We don't believe you. We don't believe you anymore. You're lying to us, and we know why you're lying. We might not be able to put it in the advanced terms that Marxists are capable of doing it. That's why when they come to us correctly, we'll accept it. Not in the way that the left approaches it, but hopefully in an American communist form they will. And they have. But they realize, fundamentally, that the ruling class is lying to them and that it has to, and that it turns the world on its head in order to defend a system of ideas that can allow for the social reproduction of the capitalist system. A system that keeps them in a position of objective privilege, of accumulating a lot of wealth. 19% of the population trusts our politicians. That means that 81% of the American people, and there's statistics that suggest it's even more, 81% of the American people think that their representatives do not actually represent them. A big chunk of them realizes, what I think we all do as communists, that what is called in this system the representatives of the people are in reality the representatives of the exploiters, oppressors, and parasitic creditors of the people. It's complete opposition. So you have a crisis of legitimacy that's objectively present. The people are not willing to continue in the old way. They're showing their willingness to mobilize. That's what BLM kind of showed. Yes, no all the critiques, but that's partly what it showed. People are willing to throw themselves into the street. Their conditions have deteriorated. And the ruling class itself cannot continue to rule in the old way, not only at home, but internationally. And we live at the heart of capitalist imperialism. And if the American empire cannot continue looting the global south, because now BRICS is rising, China, Russia, Iran, and other geopolitical players are championing a world where relations are not these unilateral form that they take with US imperialism, where you give me what I want and go fuck yourself. That's the strategy. And we'll call that the rules-based international orders. But where relations are based on mutually beneficial relations, where it's win-win, as the Chinese put it. What a simple but yet profound phrase. Win-win relations. Win-win relations. When you have that as an objective reality, which is one that even the bourgeois ideologues accept, multipolarity is it's not fully here, but it's embryonically here, it's developing, it's the future. You have the inability of our ruling class to continue ruling in the old way in the international arena, which as an integral state we cannot separate from its national condition. The point that I'm getting at here is that the objective conditions for waging a successful revolutionary struggle in the US are present. What are we missing then? Well, Lenin said you can have all of the objective conditions you want, but if you don't develop the subjective factor, you're not going to get anything. A ruling order may wobble all it wants, but if it's not knocked over, it's not going to fall. What do we need? We need a party that can organize this discontent, allow the various forms of dissent that our population is taking to have the coherence so that they're able to actually make sense of and explain the system. And when you have that, what does it mean? that the different hypotheses that are getting, whether it's the MAGA form of dissent, or the Bernie form of dissent, or the people that are just turning into nihilists, all those are different forms of dissent. If you explain to them the situation, you have created the foundation for unity, because now they're going to be able to understand at this higher level why it is that the conditions that we have are such. So you explain, give coherence. That's the premise for unity. And once you have unity and a clear understanding of the system, you can give direction. You have to do this through organizations. But what do we find when we get to these organizations? A lot of what the comrade who just spoke mentioned. We find petty bourgeois moralisms. We find the sort of theories of the compatible left, which seek to divide, which promote the national nihilism we've been talking about here. And what we find, in essence, is the institutions which fetter, which present an obstacle to the development of the subjective factor that we need in order to have a revolutionary transformation today. The essence, I think, ideologically, of that fetter in this left, I call it the purity fetish. It's the absence of genuine dialectical thinking. It's what leads a lot of these leftists to say, I'm not going to organize MAGA workers, they're too impure. They reject the task that Marxist-Leninists of the past have given us to organize the backwards section, if you want to consider MAGA backwards. I don't think they're that backwards. There's some components, sure, but if they're dissenting against the ruling institutions, there's a progressive kernel there. It's the purity fetish which says our national history is not pure. There's been ugly parts. I'm going to reject it as a whole. And it's the purity fetish which says, you know, this new multipolar world, some of the actors are not embodying the pure socialism that I have in my head, and therefore I'm going to say no and I'm going to condemn it. The basis of that worldview is the absence of dialectics, and the positive way of formulating it is through the concept of the purity fetish, which is the worldview that animates these leftists and these organizations. So you're not going to have the development of the subjective factor insofar as those are the conditions that we have. So I want to conclude by saying the prime matter, the materials there for building the sort of world that brings about an actual substantial democracy, which is just socialism. We use the term dictatorship of the proletariat. But let's think about this critically. What does democracy mean? Let's break it up etymologically. Demos and kratos. Common people, not just people in general, common people. In Spanish we have a word that doesn't necessarily exist in English in the same connotation, which is pueblo. Pueblo. But the common people. And then power, the capacity to rule. What is ruling if not dictating? So we broke down democracy. People and power, the capacity to dictate. What is the proletariat if not the people? It's the people. Dictatorship of the proletariat. The people dictating. Being autonomous, being genuinely sovereign. The dictatorship of the proletariat is nothing more than democracy, which is nothing more than socialism. So, in order to realize that, which is the culmination point, I think, of the values that this country is founded on, we need the sort of organization that can root itself in the working class, not in these middle-class PMC elements that have no necessity, that they treat politics as just petty bourgeois moralisms, but actually rooted in the working class, armed with what Engels called the sharpest weapon and best working tool of the proletariat, which is Marxism, genuine Marxism. And once we have that, and oh boy is it coming, oh boy is it coming, to sit around, maybe the next time we see each other, we'll this last part of the conversation would be obsolete. I hope it is. But once we have that, we'll have the vehicles that can bring forth the subjective factor, that can mobilize our people, and that can change the world. And it desperately needs changing. We have a demented ruling class, embodied symbolically in a decrepit Joe Biden, that's literally tiptoeing us into a nuclearized third world war. That's sending hundreds of billions of our tax dollars while our cities crumble. We've been driving around Chicago. You know how many bridges I've seen all rusted up, where the columns, half of the columns don't even connect? What happens if the columns don't connect? Can air hold it up? No. Boom, down. And it's not like it hasn't happened. Our ruling class is sending hundreds of billions of our tax dollars while we need it at home to fund a literal genocide, providing us with pictures chronicled in those little devices in our pockets that show us the most horrendous images a human being can see. Haunting images. They're haunting images. When you pull out the head of a Palestinian baby without the body, that is a haunting image. The entity that does that is evil. We're seeing all of this. It's being done with our money, with our resources. Those are our bombs doing that. It's our bombs that are being sent to neo-Nazis in Ukraine to wage a proxy war against Russia. It's hundreds of billions of our tax dollars going that route as well. So our ruling class, as it sees the system crumbling before their eyes, it's scratching tooth and nail trying to sustain its fall. And it's pushing humanity as a whole, not just Americans, into a very scary position. The only way to defeat this is not with national nihilism, it's not with pessimism, it's not with an abstract third worldism that just hopes China comes in and saves us all. SOS America, Xi Jinping come in and out. It's not what's going to do it. It's by connecting with our people, giving their dissent coherence, giving the various forms of dissent unity, and giving it direction. That requires an American Communist Party. And that party, when it arises, will be the vehicle that can complete this process that, I don't mean to be hyperbolic, but it's a process upon whose hands humanity is in. It's not hyperbolic. I wish it was. The fate of humanity rests quite literally in our ability to overthrow this ruling class. So with that, I would like to conclude. Thank you so much for hosting.